6 months after Raymond Holloway wept on his knees on a sitting room floor and his wife chose grace over grievance. The world outside their healing was preparing a second test, and this one was designed to be unsurvivable. Diane Caldwell had given birth. A boy this time, small, healthy, and entirely innocent of everything his mother had done to bring him into the world. She had named him without consulting anyone, registered his birth without listing a father, and within 3 weeks of leaving the hospital, she had done something that made even Derek Ashford pause when she told him. She had filed for child support from Raymond Holloway, not because the child was Raymond's, they both knew it was not, but because Raymond had no documentation, no DNA test, no legal record of anything, and in the absence of evidence, a claim is simply a claim waiting to be believed by the right judge. The papers arrived at Raymond's apartment on a Tuesday morning. He sat with them at his kitchen table for a long time. His Bible was open beside them, the small, worn copy he had bought from the bookstore 2 blocks away, the one whose margins were now covered in his own handwriting, filled with the verses the chaplain had pointed him toward in that concrete cell. He called Eleanor before he called his lawyer, not because she was obligated, not because their reconciliation had progressed to the point where she owed him anything, but because Raymond Holloway had finally, after everything, learned the difference between a partner and a convenience. And he was not going to face this alone without first asking the woman who had already carried far too much of his weight whether she was willing to stand beside him one more time. Eleanor listened to everything. She asked 3 questions, and then she said something that Raymond would carry with him for the rest of his life. "We face it together," she said. That's what together means. But when the courtroom battle that followed revealed not just the truth about the new baby, but the full, documented, legally recorded truth about Diane's 5-year-old daughter, and what that truth meant for a child who had spent her entire life believing Raymond Holloway was her father, who would protect that little girl? And would the woman who had every reason to walk away from all of it be the one who stepped forward instead? Dear viewers, a part 2 of this story will take you into the deepest and most powerful territory this story has to offer. The place where forgiveness meets consequence, where faith meets its hardest test, and where the definition of family is challenged and expanded in ways that will move you to your core. You will learn what it means to choose a child over a conflict, a future over a grievance, and love over everything the world says you are entitled to feel. Watch till the very end. Tell us in the comments what moved you most, and subscribe, because stories like this one are exactly what this channel was built for. 6 months is not a long time to rebuild a marriage, but it is long enough to learn the difference between a man who is sorry and a man who has changed. And Eleanor Holloway, who had spent 5 years married to a man she loved without ever truly being seen by him, had become, in the furnace of everything that had happened, extraordinarily precise at telling the two apart. Raymond had changed, not perfectly, not completely, not in the dramatic, instantaneous way that made for clean narratives and easy conclusions, but in the small, consistent, unglamorous way that real transformation always announces itself. Through 1,000 small choices made correctly when nobody was watching, through a humility that did not evaporate when life became comfortable again, through a man who showed up to every counseling session on time, who called his children every single evening without being reminded, who sat in the front row of church every Sunday morning with his worn Bible open on his knee and his pen moving across the margins with the hunger of someone making up for lost time. Eleanor had watched all of it, quietly, completely, the way she watched everything, and 6 months in she had begun, carefully, guardedly, with the measured trust of a woman who understood that the door of her heart was hers to open at whatever speed she chose, to let him back in. Not all the way, not yet, but enough that when Raymond called on that Tuesday morning, her first feeling when she saw his name on the screen was not dread, it was concern. She had answered on the second ring. Raymond's voice, when it came, she was steady, but Eleanor had learned to hear what lived underneath Raymond's steadiness, the particular quality of a man holding himself together with both hands while something threatened to pull him apart. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to hear all of it before you respond." "Go ahead," Eleanor said. He told her everything. The envelope, the child support claim, Diane's name at the bottom of the filing, the new baby, a boy 6 weeks old, whose paternity Raymond already knew was not his, but could not yet prove in a courtroom. He spoke without deflection, without self-pity, without the instinct to minimize that had once been his most reliable defense mechanism. He laid it out plainly, the way a man lays out something he is not proud of, but has decided to stop hiding from. When he finished, the line was quiet for 4 seconds. "How are you?" Eleanor asked. "Not, what are you going to do? Not, this is your mess to fix. But, how are you?" And Raymond, who had spent 40 years in a world that valued his productivity over his interior life, felt something loosen in his chest at the question. "I'm scared," he said honestly. "Not of the lawsuit, of what it means for the children, for you, for everything we've been building." Eleanor was quiet for another moment. Then, "We face it together. That's what together means." Raymond closed his eyes. His hand tightened around the phone. And he thought, not for the first time, but more sharply than ever before, about the precise and terrible magnitude of what he had once thrown away. But 6 months earlier, the morning after Raymond's release from that detention facility, a together had been the most fragile word in the English language. Eleanor had not rushed. She had never rushed anything in her life. Not the building of her empire, not the raising of her children, not the grieving of her mother. And she did not rush this. She had engaged the best marriage counselor in the city, a measured and perceptive woman named Dr. Audrey Simmons, who had sat across from Raymond and Eleanor in her quiet office and said something in the very first session that had lodged itself permanently in both of them. "Reconciliation," Dr. Simmons had said, "is not the restoration of what was. It is the construction of something entirely new, using two people who have been changed by what happened between them. The marriage you had before does not exist anymore. Henry, the question is whether you are both willing to build something better from what remains." Raymond had looked at Eleanor when Dr. Simmons said that, and Eleanor had looked back at him. And in that exchange, that long, honest, unguarded look between two people who had stopped pretending, something had been agreed upon that no contract could have formalized. They would build. Margaret had been the quiet architecture of those 6 months. She had moved into the east wing of Eleanor's property with the serene practicality of a woman who understood exactly where she was needed. Cooking Sunday dinners that filled the house with the smell of normalcy, reading to the triplets every evening, sitting with Eleanor on the back porch on nights when the weight of everything became too atmospheric for sleep. She never pushed. She never pried. But she prayed, visibly, openly, without embarrassment. And her prayers had a quality that Eleanor had come to recognize as something structural, something load-bearing. The triplets had adjusted with the resilience that children display when the adults around them are honest without being overwhelming. Joshua had become quieter and more observant, the kind of child who misses nothing and says little, storing everything for later examination. Caleb had channeled everything into football, running drills in the garden, with a focus that made Raymond laugh the first time he watched him. And Grace, little Grace, who had stood in that kitchen doorway and seen everything, had developed a habit of climbing into Eleanor's lap at random moments during the day, pressing her face against her mother's shoulder, and simply staying there until whatever she needed had been replenished. Eleanor always let her stay as long as she needed. But while the Holloway household had been quietly rebuilding itself on the foundations of faith and forgiveness, and Dr. Simmons' Tuesday sessions, Diane Caldwell had been doing what Diane Caldwell had always done best: planning. She had moved into Derek Ashford's guest room 3 days after being dismissed from Holloway Premier Estates, a detail that nobody in Eleanor's circle had known, because nobody had thought to keep watching. And in that guest room, between nursing a newborn and nursing a grievance that had curdled in the 6 months since her humiliation into something cold and methodical and entirely stripped of emotion, she had worked. Derek had found the clause. On a single paragraph buried in a subsidiary agreement from 6 years ago, signed during the early expansion of Holloway Premier Estates, when Eleanor had briefly brought in an outside investment partner to accelerate the acquisition of 3 commercial towers. The partner had since been bought out, fully and legally. But the clause, a poorly worded provision about shared decision-making rights during the partnership period, had never been formally struck from the parent agreement. It meant nothing on its own. But in the hands of a lawyer willing to argue creatively, it could be presented as an unresolved claim of partial operational authority. Not ownership, not a stake, but enough legal ambiguity to force Eleanor into months of expensive, distracting litigation, and enough public noise to damage the reputation of Holloway Premier Estates in the eyes of the institutional investors who valued stability above everything. The child support claim against Raymond was not about money. It was a distraction designed to consume Raymond's attention and Eleanor's emotional bandwidth simultaneously, splitting their focus at the exact moment the lawsuit required Eleanor's full concentration. It was, Eleanor's lead attorney Catherine Briggs would later say, one of the most calculated two-pronged attacks she had seen in 20 years of practice. But Catherine Briggs had not yet seen Eleanor Holloway fight for something she had decided to keep. That evening, Eleanor sat at the desk in her study, the same desk where she had been working the night Margaret called her about the beating, the same desk where she had first decided it was time, and she spread 3 documents before her. The child support filing, the subsidiary clause Derek's lawyer had submitted as the basis of the lawsuit, and a photograph, recent, taken outside a family court building, of Diane Caldwell carrying a small boy in a car seat with a 5-year-old girl walking beside her, holding her mother's hand. Eleanor looked at the little girl for a long time. She had her mother's jawline, but her eyes, those careful, watchful, slightly too old for her age eyes, those belonged to nobody in Diane's orbit. They belonged to a child who had been carrying uncertainty like a backpack since before she was old enough to name what uncertainty felt like. Eleanor thought of Grace, of Joshua's quiet watchfulness, of Caleb's furious, focused running. She thought of what it meant to be an innocent child in the middle of a war started by adults, and she felt something move in her chest that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with the woman her mother had raised her to be. She picked up her phone. She called Catherine Briggs. "I want a DNA test petition filed by end of week," she said. "Both children. Full documentation." A pause. "And Catherine, when the results come back, I want a welfare assessment ordered for the 5-year-old. Whatever happens in that courtroom, that child is not collateral damage. Not on my watch." Catherine was quiet for a moment. Then, "Eleanor, are you sure that level of intervention could be interpreted as—" "It could be interpreted as exactly what it is," Eleanor said. "See, someone making sure an innocent child doesn't get lost in the middle of other people's mess." She paused. "File it." She set the phone down. She looked at the photograph one more time. And somewhere in the quiet of that study, in the house that held her children and her mother-in-law, and the slow, rebuilding heartbeat of a family learning to be whole, Eleanor Holloway bowed her head and prayed the most honest prayer she had prayed since the rainy October morning she had given her life to Christ. "Lord, let me be who you made me to be, not who my anger wants me to be, not who my pain says I have the right to be, but who you made me to be, even now, especially now." Outside the study window, the garden was dark and still, and somewhere across the city, in Derek Ashford's guest room, Diane Caldwell was putting her son to sleep, unaware that the woman she had spent years underestimating had just made a move that would change the trajectory of everything. Again. But the courtroom was coming, and when Diane walked through those doors and saw not just Eleanor's legal team, but what Eleanor had chosen to do for the little girl Diane had used as a weapon for 5 years, the expression on Diane's face would be something nobody in that courtroom would ever forget. The question was not whether Eleanor would win. The question was what kind of woman she would be when she did. And the answer, as it had always been with Eleanor Holloway, was going to shock everyone. The DNA results arrived on a Friday morning. Eleanor was in the middle of a board meeting when Catherine Briggs sent the secured document to her private email, a single PDF, 3 pages, carrying the kind of information that rearranges the furniture of people's lives permanently and without apology. She did not open it during the meeting. She sat through the remaining 40 minutes of quarterly projections and acquisition updates with the focused composure that her board had come to regard as one of her most valuable professional qualities. Never knowing that their CEO was sitting at the head of that table with a document in her inbox that had nothing to do with real estate and everything to do with the most complicated chapter of her personal life. When the meeting ended and the last board member filed out, Eleanor sat alone in the conference room, the same conference room where she had once looked across the table at her husband and told him the truth about who she was. And she opened the document. She read it once, quickly. Then she set her phone face down on the table and looked out the window at the skyline her empire had helped shape. The glass and steel and concrete that represented 14 years of quiet, deliberate, disciplined work. And she allowed herself 60 seconds of stillness. Not grief, not triumph, just stillness. Because the document confirmed what everyone had already known, but nobody had yet been able to prove in a language the law recognized. Raymond Holloway was not the biological father of Brianna Caldwell, age 5, and he was not the biological father of Noah Caldwell, age 6 weeks. Neither child was his. And both children, in the cold, precise vocabulary of a DNA report, now existed in a legal space that was about to become the most contested ground in the entire case. Raymond received his copy 20 minutes later. He was on his lunch break from Meridian Property Group, sitting in his car in the parking structure, eating a sandwich he had packed himself, listening to a sermon podcast that had become part of his daily routine since the chaplain at the detention facility had given him a list of teachers he trusted. He read the document on his phone. He read it twice, and then he put the phone in his cup holder and pressed both hands flat against the steering wheel and sat with the full weight of what it meant. He had known. He had known since the recording. But knowing and having it confirmed in writing by a laboratory were two entirely different experiences, because the written confirmation carried something the knowing had not. It carried the face of a 5-year-old girl, Brianna, who had called him daddy for 5 years, who had run to the door when she heard his voice, who had fallen asleep against his shoulder at least a dozen times in the years before he had been stupid enough to let Diane move into the penthouse. Back when the visits were casual and he had told himself it was just friendship, just support, just being present for a child who seemed to need him. He had told himself a great many things in those years, but the face of that little girl was not something he could file under self-deception and move on from. She was real. She was 5 years old. And she had done absolutely nothing to deserve what the adults in her life had constructed around her. He called Eleanor. She answered before the second ring, which told him she had been waiting for his call, which told him she had already read her copy, which told him that Eleanor Holloway was, as she had always been, several steps ahead of the moment everyone else was still catching up to. "I saw it," he said. "I know," she said. "Brianna," his voice caught. He stopped, restarted. "She called me daddy, Eleanor, for 5 years." "I know," Eleanor said again, and the gentleness in her voice, the particular, unearned gentleness of a woman extending grace to a man across the full distance of everything he had caused, made Raymond press his eyes shut. "The welfare assessment," he said. "That was you. It was the right thing to do." "Eleanor," he stopped. There was no sentence that adequately followed her name in that moment. There was only the silence of a man who had run out of words for what he was feeling and had not yet learned a language sufficient for gratitude of this magnitude. "Raymond," Eleanor said quietly, "pull yourself together. We have a courtroom to walk into on Monday, and I need you present. Can you do that?" He breathed. He straightened in his seat. He picked up his sandwich and put it back down. "Yes," he said, "I can do that." Monday arrived the way important days always arrive, unremarkably, without fanfare, indistinguishable from the outside from any other Monday, and as though the universe had not received the memo about what was scheduled to happen inside Courtroom 7 of the Riverside County Civil Court at 9 o'clock in the morning. Eleanor arrived first. She wore a charcoal gray suit, understated, precise, the kind of clothing that communicates authority without announcing it. And she walked through those courthouse doors with Catherine Briggs on her left and Raymond on her right, and she did not look at the gallery or the opposing counsel's table Or the cluster of journalists near the back who had gotten wind of the case through the kind of legal gossip that travels faster than any press release. She looked straight ahead, because Eleanor Holloway had learned a long time ago that the most powerful direction to look in any room was forward. Raymond walked beside her in a dark navy suit that Margaret had pressed the night before, because Margaret had insisted, appearing at his apartment at 7 in the morning with an iron and a look that communicated clearly that her son was not walking into a courtroom with a wrinkled jacket while she still had two working hands. He had let her press the suit. He had let her straighten his tie. And when she had cupped his face in both hands, the way she had done since he was a boy, he had let himself be her son completely, without the armor of pride that had once made receiving her love feel like an admission of weakness. "Walk in there like the man God is making you," Margaret had said, "not the man you used to be." He was trying, and Derek Ashford's legal team was already seated when they entered. 4 lawyers arranged with the deliberate visual confidence of people who believed their case was airtight. Derek himself sat at the far end of the table, his expression composed, his suit expensive, his eyes moving to Raymond the moment Raymond walked through the door. Raymond looked back at him. He held the look for 3 seconds, not with aggression, not with the blind rage that had put him in handcuffs the last time they were in the same room, but with the steady, clear-eyed recognition of a man who had been through enough to know that the person sitting across from him was not worth the cost of losing himself again. Then he looked away and sat down beside his wife. Diane was at a separate table with her own lawyer, a sharp-featured man named Gerald Watts who had built his entire reputation on child support cases and knew how to make juries feel the particular discomfort of a child's vulnerability. She was dressed carefully. Her expression was arranged into something that suggested wounded dignity. She did not look at Eleanor, but Eleanor looked at her, not with malice, not with the satisfaction of a woman watching her enemy diminished, but with the focused, compassionate attention of someone trying to understand a person they would never fully understand. Because Eleanor had learned in 6 months of Sunday sermons and Dr. Simmons' Tuesday sessions and her own long, honest conversations with God, that the people who hurt you most are almost always the people most imprisoned by their own damage. When that understanding did not excuse what Diane had done, but it changed the quality of Eleanor's attention, and it changed in ways that would become clear before the morning was over, the nature of Eleanor's strategy. Catherine Briggs dismantled Derek's lawsuit in 45 minutes. She was methodical, unhurried, and devastating in the particular way of a lawyer who has prepared so thoroughly that she can afford to appear relaxed. She walked the judge through the full history of the subsidiary agreement, the original partnership, the complete buyout, the legal documentation of every subsequent amendment, and she presented as her final exhibit a legal opinion from 3 independent contract law specialists, each of whom had reviewed the clause in question and arrived at the same conclusion independently. The clause was unenforceable. It had been effectively superseded by the buyout agreement. It carried no residual legal authority, and the claim built upon it had no foundation in law, in precedent, or in fact. Derek's lead lawyer objected twice. The judge sustained neither objection. By 10:45, Derek Ashford's lawsuit against Holloway Premier Estates was dismissed with prejudice, meaning it could not be refiled. The judge noted in language that was measured but unmistakably pointed that the claim appeared to have been constructed primarily as a mechanism of harassment rather than legitimate legal redress, and that the court took a dim view of such filings. Derek sat very still through the ruling. His composure did not crack, but his jaw tightened in a way that the people watching him closely could read clearly. It was the jaw of a man recalculating. But the child support matter was more complicated. And it was here, in the second half of that Monday morning, when Gerald Watts rose to present Diane's claim, that the courtroom shifted into a different register entirely. Watts was good. He was measured and precise, and he knew exactly how to frame a narrative around an infant's vulnerability in a way that made the room lean forward. He spoke about Raymond's relationship with Brianna, about the years of informal paternity, about the principle of assumed responsibility he was building, carefully and professionally, toward a conclusion that had nothing to do with biology and everything to do with behavior. And then Catherine Briggs stood up, and she introduced the DNA results. The room went very quiet. Watts recovered quickly, pivoting to the argument of assumed paternity, of emotional bonds established over 5 years. But the pivot cost him momentum. And momentum, in a courtroom, is everything. But it was what happened next that nobody in that room had anticipated. Eleanor leaned toward Catherine and said something quietly. Catherine listened. Her expression shifted, just slightly, just briefly, into something that looked almost like surprise. Then she nodded once and stood. Your Honor, Catherine said, the petitioner wishes to address the matter of the minor child Brianna Caldwell directly. Not in the context of child support, but in the context of the welfare assessment this court ordered 2 weeks ago. The judge looked up. Proceed. Catherine turned to Eleanor, and Eleanor Holloway, the secret billionaire, the woman who had been beaten by proxy, divorced by ambush, and attacked from 2 directions simultaneously, stood up in that courtroom and spoke, not through her lawyer, not through a document, but in her own voice, clear and unhurried, and full of the particular authority of a woman who has nothing left to perform for anyone. She spoke about Brianna, about what the welfare assessment had found, a child showing signs of anxiety, of instability, of the particular emotional fragility that develops in children who have been used as instruments in adult conflicts. She spoke about what a child needed, not money, not legal victories, but consistency, safety, the presence of adults who put her needs above their own agendas. And then Eleanor Holloway said the thing that made the entire courtroom go completely, absolutely breathlessly silent. She said that she and Raymond were willing to provide supervised visitation and emotional support for Brianna. Not as a legal obligation, not as a strategic maneuver, but as a human response to the reality of a child who had called Raymond daddy for 5 years and deserved, regardless of biology, to have that relationship handled with dignity and care. She sat down. The silence lasted 4 full seconds. And then Diane Caldwell, the woman who had beaten an old woman, who had filed false claims, who had spent years constructing a plan around the destruction of the family sitting across from her, put her face in her hands, not in triumph, not in relief, in the particular undignified collapse of a woman who has spent so long preparing for war that she has no idea what to do when the person across from her refuses to fight. But the story was not over, because Derek Ashford, dismissed from court, humiliated, and now facing a counterfiling that Catherine Briggs had prepared with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had anticipated exactly this outcome, was not the kind of man who accepted defeat inside a courtroom and carried it home gracefully. He was already on his phone before he reached the parking lot, and what he was planning, the final, desperate move of a man with nothing left to lose, was going to force Eleanor and Raymond into the most personal battle they had faced yet. Not in a courtroom, but in the place where every real battle is ultimately fought. At home. Derek Ashford had always been the kind of man who smiled widest when he was most dangerous. Raymond had known him for 11 years and had never once identified this quality, because that is the particular gift of a certain kind of betrayer. They do not reveal themselves in the obvious moments. They reveal themselves in the aftermath, when you are sitting with the wreckage of everything they touched and tracing the fingerprints backward through time, finding them on things you never thought to examine while the damage was still being done. Derek had been Raymond's best man. He had stood at that altar in a charcoal suit and smiled at Eleanor as she walked down the aisle. And Eleanor, who noticed everything, had thought at the time that his smile was warm. She had revised that assessment significantly in the months since. But it was not until the Tuesday after the court hearing, 4 days after Derek walked out of courtroom 7 with a dismissed case in the particular coiled energy of a man whose plan has failed but whose intention has not, that Eleanor discovered the full dimension of what Derek Ashford had been doing in the shadows. It arrived, as most revelations do, not through dramatic confrontation, but through a quietly delivered piece of information from an unexpected source. His name was Thomas Whitfield. He was 61 years old, a retired property attorney, and he was Eleanor's uncle, her mother's younger brother, the last living connection to Grace Whitfield's side of the family. A man Eleanor had lunch with 4 times a year at a restaurant near his office, and who had known about Holloway Premier Estates from the very beginning, because he had helped Eleanor incorporate it at 22. He called her on a Tuesday afternoon, and his voice carried the particular quality of a man who has been sitting on something for longer than was comfortable. "Eleanor," he said, "I need to tell you something I should have told you 3 weeks ago, and I need you to hear it without interrupting me until I'm finished." Eleanor set down her pen. "Go ahead, Uncle Thomas." He told her that Derek Ashford had contacted him 6 months ago, 2 weeks after Raymond's arrest, during the period when Eleanor's household was still finding its footing and nobody was watching Derek carefully. Derek had approached Thomas with a proposition framed as a business opportunity, an offer to partner on a new property venture, casual and friendly on the surface, precisely engineered underneath. But embedded in the conversation, with the practiced subtlety of a man who had been planning this for years, Derek had asked Thomas about the original incorporation documents for Holloway Premier Estates, specifically about a particular early investor, a name on a document from 14 years ago that Thomas had handled personally and that had been quietly resolved long before the company became what it was today. The name on that document was Gerald Whitfield, Eleanor's father. Thomas's voice tightened as he continued. Eleanor's father had made a small early investment in the company's founding, seed money that had been fully repaid with interest within the first 2 years of operation, documented completely, legally closed. There was no ambiguity in the transaction. There was no unresolved claim. But the document, in isolation, without the accompanying repayment records, could be made to look like something it was not. Derek had been trying to obtain that document, not through legal channels, not through the court system, but through Thomas, through family, through the warm, patient cultivation of a man he had identified as Eleanor's most accessible personal connection to the company's founding history. Thomas had not given him anything, but he had also, to his shame, not told Eleanor immediately, because Derek had framed the approach so carefully, so plausibly, that Thomas had spent 3 weeks convincing himself he was misreading the situation. The court hearing had clarified things considerably. "He wasn't just building a lawsuit, Eleanor," Thomas said. "He was building a narrative, something that could be taken to the press, something that would make it look like Holloway Premier Estates was founded on disputed family money. It wouldn't hold up legally. We have every record. But legally and reputationally are 2 different battlefields, and Derek knows that." Eleanor listened to all of it without interrupting. When Thomas finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "Are you all right?" Thomas paused. "I should be asking you that." "I'm fine," Eleanor said, and it was not the fine of a woman suppressing something. It was the fine of a woman who had been through enough that this, as serious as it was, registered as a problem to be solved rather than a crisis to be survived. "Go home, Uncle Thomas. I'll handle it." She called Catherine Briggs before Thomas had reached his car. Raymond heard about Derek's approach to Thomas that evening, at Eleanor's dining table, over a dinner Margaret had cooked, with the triplets doing homework at the kitchen counter and the particular domestic warmth of a household that had fought hard for its own ordinariness. Eleanor told him plainly, the way she told him everything now, directly, completely, without softening the parts she thought might be difficult for him to hear. Because one of the things Dr. Simmons had rebuilt in their marriage, brick by careful brick, was the practice of not managing each other, of trusting the other person with the full weight of the truth rather than the curated version. Raymond listened without speaking. His fork rested on his plate. His eyes were steady, but his jaw was working in the way Eleanor had learned to recognize as the outward sign of an interior battle. The place where the old Raymond and the new Raymond met and negotiated. The old Raymond would have stood up from that table, gotten into his car, and driven to Derek's address with the same blind, costly rage that had put him in handcuffs the last time. The new Raymond sat very still, and breathed, and prayed the kind of prayer that has no words. Just the deliberate, effortful surrender of a man handing something over, because he has learned at significant personal cost that his hands are not the right ones to hold it. "What do we do?" he asked. Eleanor looked at him, and the fact that he had said we, not "what are you going to do?" Not "how do we fix my mess?" but we, with the natural ease of a man who had genuinely internalized the partnership they were rebuilding, made something warm move through her chest. "Catherine is already preparing a defamation filing," she said. "We have every document, the repayment records, the incorporation history, the full paper trail. If Derek takes anything to the press, he walks into a lawsuit that will cost him everything he has left." She paused. "But I don't think it will come to that." "Why not?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then, "Because Derek is not stupid. He is desperate. And desperate people make moves that feel powerful in the moment, but collapse under the weight of their own exposure." She picked up her fork. He knows what we have. He knew it before he walked into that courtroom. He went anyway because he needed to feel like he was doing something." She paused. "That is a man running out of road, Raymond, not a man with a plan." Raymond looked at his wife across the dinner table. This woman who had built an empire, raised 3 children, survived his failures, chosen Grace twice, and was now disassembling a coordinated attack against everything she owned with the same quiet competence she brought to everything. And he felt the full, clear, uncomplicated weight of what she was. Extraordinary. He had lived beside extraordinary for 5 years and mistaken it for ordinary because he had never bothered to look properly. He was looking now. It was Margaret who found Grace. She had gone to check on the children after dinner, a habit she had maintained since the night of the beating, a nightly circuit of the bedrooms that was equal parts grandmotherly routine and the quiet vigilance of a woman who understood that children process things in the dark that they cannot articulate in the light. Joshua and Caleb were fine. Homework done, lights out, the uncomplicated sleep of boys who burn their energy completely in the day and had nothing left for nighttime worry. But Grace's room was lit. Margaret pushed the door open gently and found her youngest grandchild sitting on the floor beside her bed. Not crying, not distressed, but engaged in the particular focused activity that Grace had developed over the past 6 months as her primary method of processing the world. She was drawing. The paper in front of her was covered in crayon figures, large and small, arranged in a loose cluster that Grace had been adding to for what looked like a considerable amount of time. Margaret lowered herself slowly to the floor beside her granddaughter, her old knees protesting the descent, and looked at the drawing. She recognized them immediately. The tall woman in the gray cardigan, the man beside her in navy, 3 smaller figures in a row, an older woman with silver hair, herself she realized with a warmth that moved through her chest, and 2 more small figures at the edge of the group, slightly separate from the cluster, but connected to it by a line Grace had drawn in careful, deliberate yellow crayon. 2 small figures, a girl and a baby. Margaret looked at her granddaughter. "Who are those 2, baby?" she asked gently, pointing to the figures at the edge. Grace looked up at her grandmother with those careful, watchful, slightly too old for her age eyes that had always seen more than the adults around her fully credited. "That's Brianna," Grace said simply, "and her baby brother." She looked back at the drawing. "They don't have a daddy. I thought maybe they could share ours." Margaret sat with that sentence for a long moment. She felt it move through her the way only a child's accidental wisdom can move through a person. Not like information, but like light through a window, illuminating everything in the room at once. She put her arm around Grace. She pulled her close, and she pressed her lips to the top of her granddaughter's head and held her there. This child who had stood in a kitchen doorway in her pajamas and watched the world crack open, and who had responded in the private language of crayons and paper, with an instinct toward inclusion that shamed and humbled and broke Margaret Holloway's heart in the most beautiful possible way. "I think that is the most loving idea I have ever heard," Margaret whispered. Grace nodded seriously, as though this had never been in question. Then she picked up her yellow crayon and added a sun above the entire drawing. Large, uneven, abundantly yellow. And the expression on her face as she drew it was one of complete and uncomplicated satisfaction. Margaret brought the drawing to Eleanor that night. She knocked on the study door, entered without waiting for an answer the way she always did, and set the paper on the desk in front of her daughter-in-law without a word. Eleanor looked at it for a long time. She looked at the gray cardigan figure, the navy figure beside her, the 3 children in a row, the silver-haired woman, and the 2 figures at the edge, connected by a line of careful yellow crayon, beneath a sun that Grace had made too large for the page and drawn anyway. She looked at it until her vision blurred, and then she pressed the back of her hand to her mouth and sat very still, the way she always sat when something was moving through her that she was not ready to release into the room. Margaret sat in the chair across the desk and said nothing, because Margaret Holloway had lived long enough to know that some moments do not need words. They need witnesses. She witnessed. And after a long time, after Eleanor had composed herself with the quiet discipline of a woman who had been composing herself through impossible things for longer than was fair, Eleanor looked up at her mother-in-law. "She is 5 years old," Eleanor said. Her voice was steady, but the steadiness was costing her something visible. She didn't choose any of this. She didn't choose her mother. She didn't choose to be used. Eleanor looked back at the drawing. She just needed someone to see her. "Yes," Margaret said simply. Eleanor was quiet for another moment. Then she looked up with an expression that Margaret recognized. Not because she had seen it on Eleanor's face before, but because she had seen it once, a long time ago, on the face of a woman named Grace Whitfield, in a hospital bed in the last week of her life. It was the expression of a person who has arrived, finally and completely, at the full understanding of who they are and what they are here to do. "I'm going to call Diane tomorrow," Eleanor said. Margaret did not express surprise. She simply nodded, as though this was the only logical conclusion the evening could have reached, as though Grace's drawing had always been pointing here, as though the yellow crayon line between the two groups of figures had been, from the moment it was drawn, an instruction rather than a wish. "What will you say?" Margaret asked. Eleanor looked at the drawing one more time. At the sun, Grace had made too large and drawn anyway. "I'll say what needs to be said," she answered. "I'll say what my mother would have said. And I'll say what God has been preparing me to say since the morning I gave him my life in that church." She paused. "I'll say, let's stop fighting over the wreckage and start thinking about the children." Margaret stood. She crossed the room. She placed both hands on Eleanor's shoulders from behind, the way a mother steadies a daughter before something important, and she held them there for a moment. "Your mother would be so proud of you," she said quietly. Eleanor covered one of Margaret's hands with her own. Outside the study window, the garden was still and dark, and somewhere across the city, in a small apartment that smelled like formula and sleeplessness, and the particular exhaustion of a woman who had been running on adrenaline and grievance for so long that she had forgotten what stillness felt like. Diane Caldwell was sitting on her kitchen floor with a 6-week-old boy asleep on her chest and a 5-year-old girl pressed against her side, and she was staring at the wall with the hollow, undefended expression of a woman who had finally run completely out of fight. Her phone was on the counter. Derek had called 4 times that evening. She had not answered, because something had shifted in Courtroom 7 that Monday morning. Something she had not anticipated and could not immediately name, and it had been shifting ever since, quietly and persistently, like a tide that does not announce itself, but simply arrives until the ground beneath you is no longer what it was. Eleanor Holloway had stood up in that courtroom and spoken about Brianna, not about the lawsuit, not about the DNA results, not about the 5 years of deception or the beating or the divorce papers or any of the 1,000 things she had every right and reason to speak about. She had spoken about Brianna, about what Brianna needed, about what Brianna deserved. And Diane, who had spent years constructing a version of Eleanor as an obstacle, a target, a problem to be solved, had sat at that table and listened to the obstacle speak about her daughter with more genuine care than Diane had managed in months. She looked down at Brianna sleeping against her side, at the child's face, peaceful, unguarded, entirely trusting in the way of children who have not yet been taught that the world does not always deserve their trust. And Diane Caldwell felt something crack open in her chest that had been sealed shut for so long she had forgotten it was there. It was not repentance. Not yet. It was something smaller and more fragile than repentance. It was the first honest question she had asked herself in years. What have I done to my children? But the answer to that question, and what Diane chose to do with it, was coming. And when Eleanor's phone call arrived the following morning, what happened between those two women in the privacy of a conversation nobody else witnessed would become the foundation of the story's most unexpected and most powerful conclusion. The question was not whether Eleanor would extend grace one more time. The question was whether Diane, stripped of her plan, exhausted by her own damage, and faced with the one thing she had never prepared for, was capable of receiving it. Eleanor made the call at 7:30 in the morning. Not because 7:30 was a strategic hour, not because she had calculated the optimal moment to catch Diane off guard, or emotionally vulnerable, or in any of the positions that people who fight to win are always calculating. But because 7:30 was when Eleanor finished her morning prayer, closed her Bible, set her coffee cup on the kitchen counter, and felt, with the clear, unambiguous certainty of a woman who had learned to distinguish between her own voice and the quieter, steadier voice beneath it, that it was time. She did not rehearse what she would say. She had learned in the months since giving her life to Christ that the conversations that matter most are the ones you walk into with open hands rather than prepared scripts. Prepared scripts protect the speaker. So open hands serve the moment. She dialed. She waited. Diane answered on the fifth ring, and the sound of her voice, rough-edged and unguarded in the way of someone pulled from the shallow, exhausted sleep of a new mother, told Eleanor everything she needed to know about where Diane was before a single word had been exchanged. She was depleted. She was undefended. And she was, for perhaps the first time in years, simply herself, without the architecture of strategy and performance that had held her together through everything. Eleanor, Diane's voice carried a quality that was difficult to name. Not quite fear, not quite relief, but something suspended between the two, like a person standing at a door they have knocked on without being certain they wanted it to open. "Good morning, Diane," Eleanor said. And she meant it, not as a pleasantry, not as a performance of civility, but as a genuine acknowledgement of the morning, of the day, of the shared humanity of two women who had never been enemies by nature, but had been placed on opposite sides of a war neither of them had started alone. Silence. Then Diane said, quietly, roughly, without preamble, "Why are you calling me?" "Because we need to talk about your children," Eleanor said. "Not in a courtroom, not through lawyers, just us. Two women who both understand what it means to love a child more than anything else in the world." Another silence. Longer this time. Eleanor waited. She had learned in 5 years of marriage and 6 months of counseling and 14 years of boardrooms that the most powerful thing a person can do in a silence is resist the urge to fill it. Silence, if given enough room, does its own work. It strips away the noise people hide behind and leaves them standing in the open with whatever is actually true. Diane stood in that open space for 11 seconds. Eleanor counted, not impatiently, but with the focused attention of a woman who understood that she was witnessing something fragile and important and entirely unrepeatable. Then Diane said, and her voice when it finally came, was the voice Eleanor had never heard from her before. Not the bold, practiced voice of the woman who had walked through the penthouse like she owned it. Not the cold, strategic voice of the woman who had laid out a destruction plan to her friend on a phone call in a sitting room. But the voice underneath all of that, smaller, older, tired in the bone-deep way that only the genuinely remorseful are tired. "I don't know how to do this," Diane said. "I don't know how to. I've been fighting for so long that I don't know what I'm doing anymore. I don't even know what I wanted. I thought I knew. But I look at my kids and I—" She stopped. A breath. The unmistakable sound of a woman pressing the back of her hand to her mouth. "What I did to Brianna. Using her like that. She trusted me. She's 5 years old and she trusted me completely, and I used that. I used my own child." Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment. She thought of Grace's drawing, of the yellow crayon line connecting the two groups of figures, of the sun Grace had made too large and drawn anyway. "You can stop," Eleanor said gently. "That's what I'm calling to tell you. You can stop fighting. Not because you've lost, but because there is nothing left worth fighting for on that battlefield. The only thing worth fighting for now is in your apartment, Diane. A 5-year-old girl and a 6-week-old boy who need their mother to choose them. Completely. Without a backup plan." The sound that came from Diane then was not elegant. It was not the composed, manageable grief of someone who had prepared themselves for an emotional moment. It was the sound of a dam that had been holding back more water than it was built for, finally completely giving way. She wept, fully, messily, without dignity, and Eleanor sat on her kitchen counter and held the phone and let her. Because Eleanor had learned from Dr. Simmons and from her mother and from the God she had given her life to on a rainy October morning, and that the most healing thing you can offer a person in the moment of their genuine breaking is simply your unwithdrawing presence. She did not rush Diane. She did not fill the space with reassurances or conditions, or the careful legal language of a woman protecting her interests. She simply stayed on the line and let Diane weep until the weeping ran its course, because that is what grace looks like when it is not performing itself for an audience. It looks like staying on the phone. They spoke for 40 minutes. Eleanor would never share the full contents of that conversation with anyone. Not Raymond, not Margaret, not Catherine Briggs. Because some conversations belong only to the people who have them, sealed by the particular intimacy of two human beings meeting each other in their most unguarded state. And to expose them to outside examination would be to damage the very thing that made them sacred. But what Eleanor did tell Raymond that evening at the kitchen table was this. She is not a monster. She made monstrous choices, but she is not a monster. A pause. She is a woman who learned a long time ago that the only way to get what she needed was to take it, and nobody ever showed her a different way. Another pause. Until now, maybe. I don't know, that part is up to her. But I said what I needed to say, and she heard it. The rest belongs to God. Raymond looked at his wife across the dinner table for a long moment. Then he said, "What did you say to her?" Eleanor picked up her fork. "I told her the truth," she said simply. That her children deserve a mother who is present and accountable and free from the weight of a war she was never going to win. That Brianna deserves to know her story honestly. Not the version Diane constructed, but the real one, when she's old enough to receive it. And that if she was willing to step back from all of this, the lawyers, the filings, the plans, and simply focus on her children, then I would not pursue anything further against her personally. Raymond was very still. "You dropped everything against her?" "Catherine is handling Derek separately," Eleanor said. "He made this his business when he targeted my company and my family. That has consequences. But Diane," she paused, "Diane is a mother with 2 small children and no income and no plan. The most powerful thing I can do to Diane Caldwell is not destroy her. It is leave her with enough room to become something better." She looked at Raymond steadily. "And to make sure her children are not casualties of her choices." Raymond set his fork down, and he looked at his wife, this extraordinary, infuriating, incomprehensible woman who had been sitting across from him at tables for 5 years, and whom he was only now, finally, actually seeing. And he said the truest thing he had said in years. "I do not deserve you," he said. "I know that. I am not saying it to be self-deprecating. I am saying it because it is factually, completely true, and I want you to know that I know it." Eleanor looked back at him, and the smile that moved across her face was not the careful, measured smile she gave the world. It was the small, private, entirely unguarded smile of a woman who is genuinely, unexpectedly, in spite of everything, happy. "You don't deserve me," she agreed, "but God gave you to me anyway. So here we are." Derek Ashford received Catherine Briggs' defamation filing on a Thursday morning. It was 41 pages, comprehensive, meticulously documented, and constructed with the particular thoroughness of a lawyer who had been waiting for permission to release the full weight of her preparation. It detailed every element of Derek's two-pronged attack. The fraudulent lawsuit, the approach to Thomas Whitfield, the false charges filed against Raymond, the years of calculated friendship maintained for the purpose of exploitation. And it attached, as exhibits, documentation that Raymond had not known Catherine possessed until she presented it to him the week before. Phone records, financial transactions, a trail of digital communication between Derek and Diane that stretched back 4 years and told in the dry language of timestamps and account numbers the story of a plan that had been constructed slowly, patiently, and with the kind of long-game deliberateness that only truly cold calculation produces. Derek's lawyer called Catherine within 2 hours of receiving the filing. Settlement discussions began that afternoon. By the following Tuesday, Derek Ashford had agreed to a settlement that included full financial restitution to Raymond for the period of wrongful imprisonment, a formal retraction of every false charge filed, and a legally binding agreement that prevented him from any further contact with or action against any member of the Holloway family. He signed the documents in his lawyer's office without looking up from the page. And when it was done, when the pen was set down and the folder was closed, and the last legal thread connecting Derek Ashford to the life of Raymond Holloway was finally completely severed, he sat in that office and felt, perhaps for the first time in his adult life, the full weight of what it costs a person to spend their energy on destruction rather than construction. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. Some reckonings arrive without commentary. They simply settle, like sediment, to the bottom of a life and stay there. It was a Saturday morning in early spring when the two families met for the first time. Eleanor had arranged it carefully, not in a formal setting, not in a lawyer's office or a neutral location that carried the clinical atmosphere of a supervised exchange, but in her garden. Oh, the same garden where Raymond had taught Caleb to plant tomatoes, where Joshua read on the bench under the oak tree, where Grace drew in her sketchbook on weekend afternoons with the focused serenity of a child who had found, in paper and crayon, a language equal to everything she felt. Diane arrived at the garden gate with Brianna holding her hand and Noah in a carrier against her chest. She looked different from the woman who had walked into courtrooms and penthouse kitchens with her chin raised and her armor polished. She looked quieter, not defeated but settled in the particular way of a person who has put down something heavy and is still adjusting to the unfamiliar lightness of their own hands. Eleanor opened the gate. They stood facing each other for a moment. These two women who had circled each other in the orbit of one man's failures for 5 years, who had never once in all that time actually seen each other clearly. And what they saw now in the unguarded morning light of a spring garden was not an enemy and a victor. It was two mothers standing at a gate, trying to do right by their children. Eleanor stepped back and gestured toward the garden. "Come in," she said. Grace saw Brianna before anyone else did. She looked up from her sketchbook on the garden bench, registered the small figure standing at the gate holding her mother's hand, and something moved across her face that was entirely uncomplicated and entirely 5 years old. She picked up her sketchbook. She walked across the garden, turned and she held it out to Brianna. Open to the drawing she had made the night Margaret found her on the bedroom floor. The crayon figures, the yellow line, the oversized sun. Brianna looked at the drawing, then she looked at Grace. "Is that me?" she asked, pointing to the smaller figure at the edge connected by the yellow line. "Yes," Grace said, "and that's your baby brother." She pointed to the other figure, then she pointed to the sun. "I made the sun too big, but I drew it anyway because I wanted it to be really sunny." Brianna studied the drawing with the focused attention of a child receiving something important. Then she looked up at Grace and said, with the pure, unfiltered logic of a 5-year-old who has not yet learned to complicate simple things, "Can I color with you?" Grace's face broke into the widest, a most uncomplicated smile Eleanor had seen from her daughter in months. "Yes," she said, and she took Brianna's hand and led her to the bench under the oak tree, and within 4 minutes they were sitting side by side, with their heads bent over a shared sketchbook, the yellow crayon moving between them like it had always belonged to both of them. Eleanor stood at the garden gate and watched them. She felt Raymond's hand find hers, warm, steady, present in the way he had been learning to be present for 6 months, and she held it without turning to look at him, because she did not want to look away from what was happening on that bench. Two little girls, a yellow crayon, a sun too large for the page, and the particular irreducible grace of children who have not yet been taught to carry the weight of what their parents did to each other. Margaret watched from the kitchen window. She stood with her coffee cup and her silver hair and her 63 years of accumulated wisdom, and she watched her family in the garden below. The family that had broken and been rebuilt and was now, in the slow, unglamorous, beautiful way of real things, becoming something none of them had planned for and all of them needed. She thought of her son on his knees on a sitting room floor. She thought of Eleanor pressing her forehead to her bruised jaw in the dark. She thought of 3 children in pajamas at a kitchen doorway and the particular expression on Grace's face. Not the terrified expression of the night of the beating, but the serene, focused expression of a child drawing a yellow line between 2 groups of people and calling it connection. She set her coffee cup down. She bowed her head, and she prayed the simplest prayer she had prayed in 63 years of praying. Thank you. Just that. Just 2 words. Because sometimes 2 words are the most precise and complete thing a human being can offer in response to the goodness of God. And Margaret Holloway had always believed that precision was a form of reverence. Raymond and Eleanor renewed their vows on a Sunday afternoon in October, 1 year to the month after Eleanor had knelt at the front of a church that smelled like wood polish and old hymns and given her life to Christ. It was not a large ceremony. It was not designed to be a performance or a statement or a demonstration of anything to anyone who had watched the unraveling of their marriage with interest. It was designed to be true, and it was. Margaret sat in the front row with Noah asleep in her arms. Because Diane, who was working her way carefully and imperfectly toward accountability, had asked Margaret 2 weeks before the ceremony whether she would hold him during the service. And Margaret had said yes without hesitation, because Margaret Holloway had never needed a biological connection to love a child with her whole heart. Joshua and Caleb stood beside their father as junior groomsmen in matching navy suits that Margaret had pressed herself. Grace stood beside her mother in a white dress she had chosen with the decisive authority of a child who knows exactly what she wants. And in her hands, instead of a bouquet, she carried a sketchbook. Because Grace had decided that the most important thing to bring to her parents' wedding was her drawings, and nobody had argued with her, because nobody who knew Grace argued with her about her drawings. Brianna sat in the second row beside Thomas Whitfield, wearing a yellow dress that she had also chosen herself, watching the ceremony with those careful, watchful eyes that had seen more than a 5-year-old should see, but had, in the garden on a spring morning, with a shared sketchbook and a yellow crayon, begun, slowly, tentatively, one drawing at a time, to see something new. The pastor who had presided over Eleanor's salvation stood at the front of that church and spoke about the thing that had carried this family through everything it had survived. Not strategy, not strength, not the empire or the legal team or the recordings or the financial resources that had made the victories possible. Grace, the particular, costly, illogical, or world-defying grace of people who choose to be more than what was done to them, who choose to build where they could burn, who choose to include where they have every right to exclude, who choose to forgive not because the other person deserves it, but because the person doing the forgiving deserves to be free. He looked at Eleanor as he said it, and Eleanor standing at the altar in the gray dress she had chosen because it was the color of the cardigan that had always hung on the hook by the kitchen door, the small private symbol of the woman she had always been before anyone thought to look, felt the truth of every word settle into her, like something she had always known, but was only now hearing said aloud in the right room at the right moment. She looked at Raymond beside her, at his worn Bible in the inside pocket of his jacket, visible at the edge, the way he carried it everywhere now, not as a performance of faith, but as the natural habit of a man for whom faith had become as necessary and as unremarkable as breathing. He looked back at her, and in his eyes, in the eyes of the man who had once stood at a different altar and looked at her without truly seeing her, she saw something she had been waiting for longer than she had admitted to herself. She saw someone who finally completely looked back, and that, in the end, was the thing that shocked everyone. Not the empire, not the legal victories, not the exposure of the mistress or the dismantling of the plan or the courtroom that changed everything. But this, a woman who had every reason to destroy chose instead to rebuild. A man who had thrown away everything real found his way back to it. A little girl drew a yellow line between 2 groups of people and called it family. And a God who makes all things new, quietly, completely, without fanfare, did exactly what he promised. That was the miracle. That was always the miracle. Not the one that announces itself in the dramatic moments, but the one that works through the faithful ones, through the women who stay on the phone, through the men who put down their pride, through the children who share their yellow crayons, through the mothers-in-law who say, "He is still my son," through the grace that costs everything and gives back more than any of them knew how to ask for. That is the grace that shocked everyone, and it is available to every single person who chooses it.